So let's talk about sex and gender in the Sociology project, which is the first slide. This will cover some basic questions. The big questions are, where do differences between men and women come from? How have the lives of men and women changed in the past 50 years? How are sex lives shaped by biology and society? And how has sexual behavior changed in the last 50 years? Just keep in mind now that this is a really broad topic and we're only giving it a cursory inspection. You can major in gender studies if this is something as a sociologist you're interested in studying, so I encourage you to do that, but we're just going to sort of skim over it since this is an introductory class. Question 1, where do differences between men and women come from? Well, what the most important question is, what do differences actually mean? So for example, you ask the question, do males in general score higher than females on standardized math tests? And the bottom line is that they do, but does that mean that there is a sex difference between men and women in mathematics skills? Or keep in mind that more people score in the middle of the distribution than at either extreme. That's what the normal distribution indicates. But is there a difference between men and women in mathematics skills? Males have higher average, but many members will have higher averages who are below average of sex with lower averages. So that's a long-winded way of saying that some of the differences may be accounted for not by sexual differences between men and women, but because of how society encourages or discourages women from being in mathematical careers. And this gets back to the topic of gender socialization. What shapes gender differences in behavior and preferences? Some of them are biological difference, including hormones, genetics, male and female primary and secondary anatomy, and brain structures. Some of it is a social construction of gender, including how people parent, something as simple as the mass media, how they appeal to children. Even something as simple as the colors that you paint the nursery can be a construction of gender, with, of course, men being, or boys having a blue bedroom and girls having a pink bedroom. What is the difference between sex and gender? Well, sex essentially is the biological grouping based on anatomy, chromosomes, and level of hormones. So you may be sexually a female with a high level of male sex hormones, and when you think this is kind of binary, it's absolutely not binary, or perhaps more chromosomal material. Gender, on the other hand, is a result of how society shapes differences and inequities between men and women. So for example, back in the 50s and 60s, women being herded into nursing careers instead of being a physician. That had nothing to do with any sex differences, much to do with society determining what kind of careers women should have. And then, of course, there are people who transcend gender, going from masculine to feminine or feminine to masculine pursuits, and even transsexuals. This challenges our assumption about how sex and gender and how they go together. Gender differences change over time and setting. The rationale for social construction of gender is based on the difference between settings. So gender can be very situational, and these gender arrangements have changed over time. So for example, men can be caretakers for children, but it's assumed because of gender differences are in the elapse of time that women are more likely to be involved in childcare than men. What does the fact that gender differences vary across situations and over time tell us about the concept of gender? Well, it tells me that it's a very fluid concept. It doesn't change quickly. It changes slowly in fits, and it changes due to many conditions, including economic conditions, historical conditions, environmental conditions, etc. One of the things that people, with respect to sex and gender, have to deal with is stereotypes, which are beliefs about a group of people that are often untrue or exaggerated as a description for that group. They may or may not have any truth to them. Researchers' findings reveal that what people hear from others about whether their sex is better at doing something affects their confidence and even their actual performance. So if women are told that they're not as good at mathematics, they may not pursue mathematical careers. It may actually impair their performance. Social context, for example, determines how macho someone is. Question 2. How have the lives of men and women changed over the last 50 years? Well, one of the ways they've changed is, or one of the conditions or one of the characteristics that have changed a lot. So if you were to find a telephone book, if you remember what those are, or have seen one, and checked out a telephone book, you might notice in the 1950s there were very few women physicians. Nowadays, it's very common for women to be physicians and men to be nurses. And that's just one example. The lives of parenting have changed. Co-parenting is far more common than mother raising children, women working outside the home. So the last 50 years have changed a lot. So employment has changed, educational opportunities have changed, and women have become a huge part of the workforce, both the paid workforce and still at home workforce. There are more women in professional schools like medicine and law than ever. In fact, they outnumber men in those professions. They've experienced an increase in wages, although there's still a gap between men and women. Women share higher jobs, responsibilities at work, especially in service areas and management. The feminist movement and laws against sexual discrimination have grown and changed the face of America to some extent. And the steady increase in women's educational level is noted. More women are students at IVCC than men are, for example. There's even changes in women's jobs. There used to be occupational sex segregation, where women would be stuck as secretaries or working in what they used to call a pink ghetto. Well, that's changed dramatically. Sex segregation declined substantially in the 1970s and 80s. There was a famous movie done in the 80s called 9 to 5 that starred Dolly Parton, and it was about women working in a secretarial pool. That would not probably happen today. And if it did, it would be, there'd probably be complaints about it. This decline has been more slow ever since then, but it's still declining. Jobs still segregated partly due to the socialization, hiring discrimination. For example, at Illinois Valley Community College, we've had a whole litany of college presidents, all but one are men, and there's probably a good 16 or so. Women aren't seen as at the top of an organization as much as men are, and so the segregation still goes on. It happens in certain security jobs like police and fire and nuclear power plants. In the last 40 years, occupational sex segregation has declined significantly. Maybe we'll get a woman president someday, but I'm not sure. Maybe a woman vice president. The impact on men has been dramatic. Women have entered traditionally male employment more than men have entered traditionally female employment activities, like parenting or working inside the home. There's a great stigma, or the stigma is greater for men to engage in female-identified activities. There was another movie back in the 80s called Mr. Mom, starring Michael Keaton, and it was kind of a parody on a man staying home with his family. Men's household work has increased, but slightly. They tend to still segregate the kinds of work inside and outside the home. Employed fathers spend more time caring for their children than they did 50 years ago, but so do employed mothers. So the amount of time spent with children has increased in both sexes. Question 3, how are our sex life shaped by biology or society? Well, there are some dramatic measures, like some tribes in different parts of the world have dramatic measures to signify women, not the least of which is the long-necked tribe in Thailand. Sometimes it's genital mutilation, but it happens in the United States as well. So there are drastic measures like breast augmentation, facial reconstructive or plastic surgery, and some of these are pretty dramatic measures that men and women under. Your sexual orientation can be described as what your preferred type of partner, whether it's homosexual or heterosexual, which heterosexual tends to be the normative stance, or even bisexual, where the person generally prefers one type of partner, but will also be involved with another type of other orientation. Currently, there are a staggering 56 plus labels that describe gender. Does biology influence sexual orientation? Well, to some extent it does. For example, there's a higher percentage of identical twins of gay men who are also gay compared to a lower percentage of fraternal twins of gay brothers, and even a lower percentage of adopted brothers. Incidentally, twin studies and adoption studies are ways of measuring and testing genetics and environment. The similar patterns found in women. So you can conclude that both, especially genes and environment, have an impact on sexual orientation. Sexual behavior was something that evolutionary theorists talked about early on. There are specific sex genes that help men and women produce offspring, called sex chromosomes. For women, the number of surviving children will not be enhanced by having frequent sex with multiple partners. So they tend to be more monogamous than men. Genes that encourage frequent casual sex increase in men's number of offspring that survive, and so they tend to be more casual in their sexual approach, leading to what's called the double standard. There are sexual minorities, people that aren't in the majority, anyone who's not heterosexual or who is transgendered. Heteronormative means that the culture and institutions send messages that everyone who is normal is heterosexual. And of course, I think that's changing. So one pervasive problem in our culture is homophobia. It's based on the idea that people have fears about people that are homosexuals. Most of it's based on a lack of experience or lack of education. It's a bias directed at persons because of their sexual orientation. So same-sex marriage is currently legal in the United States and in many places around the world. It took a long time, and like dominoes fell pretty quickly when it did. And of course, everyone has their own opinion. I've noticed over the last 20 years of teaching that younger students, and over those 20 years, have become more open-minded as opposed to their parents or grandparents, not only about same-sex marriage, but cohabitation. How has sexual behavior changed over the last 50 years? Well, it's changed pretty dramatically, including opinions about premarital sex. There's an increasing proportion of Americans that have sex before marriage. as my mother-in-law used to call it, sinning, living in sin. American parents are by and large against teens having sex, although they do anyway. Interestingly enough, the birth rate among adolescents has gone down in the last 60 years steadily. And of course, people have opinions about cohabitation. The increased number of young couples in relationships that live together as unmarried couples. This happened before as well. It especially happened in interracial marriages. Something that's a phenomenon that's gone on for decades is called hooking up, having sexual liaisons with no expectation of a relationship, and basically it's having sex with someone that's consensual. And my experience as a therapist and as a teacher is that hookups generally don't lead to very healthy and long-term relationships, but it does happen. And of course, there's a whole issue of gender scripts. So how much change has occurred in the sexual and romantic behavior that is scripted by gender? Well, lots. If we went back 100 years ago, women would never ask a man out, but nowadays that's not uncommon. Imagine if you're a man today asking your intended person's father if you can go out or even go for a walk and talk with them. It just doesn't happen nowadays. The gender scripts do change. An example is that sex before marriage has become even more acceptable. There's a little change in gender differences in what is expected in the romantic and sexual realm. And in hookups, women feel obligation to give pleasure and men tend to be more selfish, although that's not always the case. Births outside of marriage have been decreasing. They're common, and they increase in all education, income, and racial groups, but teen pregnancy has gone down. The highest rates occur among the most disadvantaged people, including African Americans and Latinos. Reduction in the stigma of pregnancy outside of marriage related to acceptance of marriage before sex. So people don't necessarily judge other people if they have a baby before they're married. There are generational differences. Younger generation is more likely to have sex before marriage, to have cohabitated before marriage, and to have more sexual partners. Married or cohabited people report more frequent sex in the last year than married couples.